Hello, good evening, and welcome to today's session on BIC streams, Science Under Constraints, Coming of the Age of Indian Science. Joining us today are our panelists, Hari Pulakkat, science writer and journalist, and Jahnavi Phalkey, historian of science. They're here to discuss Hari's new book, Space, Life, Matter, which captures the story of the struggles and triumphs of leaders of science and the institutions they founded. With that, welcome everyone, and we'll be posting the full bios of the speakers in the chat box. Please do post your questions in the Q&A box. Over to you, Jahnavi.
Thank you very much, Raghu. It's a pleasure always to do anything with the Bangalore International Center, and I'm especially pleased that you are now increasingly paying attention to topics in science. So thank you very much. Thank you especially for asking me to read this book, which has just come out, to the extent where I think neither the author nor I have actually received hard copies of the book. We are both making do with PDFs of the volume, and so it's a brand new book which I'm very happy to have read and have a discussion about it with Hari. So allow me to sum up what I thought Hari was doing in the book before I offer it to him to tell me that actually I didn't read it correctly at all. So what we have in this book are three sections that are divided into several chapters, where Hari is talking about free India's, what one might say, first and to some extent second generation of scientists and engineers, told through an intergenerational story of their activities, filtered through stories of equipment. Now, this is something that is very close to my heart, because as a historian of science, that's something I have tried to do in my own work earlier. But in a far, in a more delimited area, I looked at experimental nuclear physics, and Hari has tried to give us a more broader view of research and the quest to acquire and build equipment in the later half of the 20th century. So I am intrigued by many things that he's done in the book, and I'm going to ask him further questions. But Hari, let me start by asking a question that I think is an obvious one, because of the state of what one might call science writing or science journalism in India. It's remarkable that we have so few people, despite the sort of strong professional conversation on science that exists in the country, that science and engineering are both preferred careers. People often go into them through pressure or through a desire, through aspiration, etc. But there isn't a public discourse, or what I often like to call a cultural conversation on science, that is strong. So what drew you to this field at all? Can we understand a little bit about that?
Well, when I studied in school and later in college, I studied a little bit of science. I studied zoology, chemistry, and botany. I did not enjoy even one class till I finished my undergraduate degree.
Okay.
But on the other hand, I enjoyed many books that I read. So I could see the difference between, reading dull textbooks and sitting in classrooms in syllabuses that I did not want to know. Plus, the difference between that and reading a really well-written book. So then I went to journalism. In the first few years, I did not think of science writing as a career. It's only after 4 years, again, by reading books, when I went to Delhi, I had a good library, and I started reading people like Lewis Thomas, the Second Creation, which I really enjoyed, and many other books. So then I thought this is a good thing to do. But it took me a long time to convince editors to give me an opportunity, because nobody thought that science was that important. So It was actually T.N. Nayanan who, it took me only 30 seconds to convince him that it was important in business world. But till then, it was very difficult.
Yeah.
But then after I started writing, then I realized it's still not easy, because it's really a hard sell. To selling a story on science to editor is quite difficult, because they have their own understanding and prejudices and likes and dislikes, and they didn't consider science as an important story, anything on science. Probably with some justification, because in the 90s, very few papers from India made it to Nature or Science. But that changed after 2000, and now it is quite common. So I think one of the reasons why we didn't have enough journalists covering science is that science itself was quite small. But probably not the only reason, because now it is not that small, but we still don't have. And those who are writing in newspapers still find it difficult to get their stories through.
Yeah. Yeah, I've struggled myself actually to understand why this is the case, because, as I said, professionally we consider it an important field, and, therefore one would expect that one would want a cultural conversation on it, but that's a conversation probably that will go, take us slightly away from the book, which I don't want to do today, although it's something that's quite important, especially to you, because it's at the heart of your profession, and it's something important for me now because of the kind of work that I do with Science Gallery. So coming to your book, how did you conceptualize it? How did you settle for this approach, which sort of, so it was heartening for me again as a historian of science to see that while you have individuals, you're not sort of focusing on great individuals in the sense that their stories are intergenerational. So even when you pick up prominent scientists, you look at both their mentors and their mentees, and in a sense that that connection, that network, that comes through for each and every person that has been not brought into the book. So what I'd like to understand is sort of, I wouldn't just call them networks, but it's sort of so intergenerational science communities, intergenerational science communities, and their quest to build equipment in order to, and weaving the stories in order to tell the story of science in India in the later half of the 20th century and beyond. How did you settle for this approach? What was your starting point? Were there any false starts?
So, so every journalist worth his salt want to write a book. That is, so I have been trying to write a book at least for 15 years. So from about 2005 onwards, I've been thinking about a book, but a book. I didn't have any idea. Around 2011, I started work on a book on Indian math, and then I worked for 2 years. I read a little bit and then I gave it up. I thought this was not possible for me because of various reasons. I didn't have enough information, and I was not sure whether this will actually become a readable book. And then I was not thinking about anything when an agent called me up and said, "Do you have an idea?" So I said, okay, and I didn't want to lose that opportunity. So I wrote down in 2 pages what I thought. I thought I will look at, since I was writing on science, I thought I would look at science. I had always known that things were difficult. I didn't know why, but I knew that things were difficult. I thought, okay, let me look at this and understand what happened actually. And in about 1 hour, I wrote something, a proposal, and with a list of 10 chapters, which I thought would be interesting, and then sent it to him. And said, you look at this and then tell me whether this idea works or not. To my astonishment, 1 hour later, he calls me and said, this is great. I've sent it to all the publishers.
Okay.
Now this was difficult because I didn't think it was a proper proposal. Because the chapters list, the 10 chapters I had drawn up, but just very arbitrary, and quite vague. So now I could not do anything, but then I got offers. I got 3 or 4 offers from publishers. And I chose Hachette because I had a conversation with the editor, and we actually talked about, and they wanted me to look at personalities, and I said, because anyway I would look at personalities. And then we signed a contract, and then I started work. It took about a year of work before this particular book grew, this structure. Because one challenge was to make it a coherent narrative. You can have, it's one thing to have 10 separate chapters, but another to have a common theme running through across all that. And my initial list of 10 chapters didn't have any sort of coherence. That was not a story. It was just 10 lectures. I mean, in fact, one of the publishers asked me, why don't you write a book on 10 great things India had done? Now, this was exactly that. And I didn't want to do it. And we've had an understanding that the book will evolve, with Hachette, with the publisher, that the book will evolve, and whatever shape it gets in the end will be with the book. So after 1 year, I realized, and the extraordinary thing is I didn't know many of these things, although I had been covering science for about nearly about 25 years at that time. I hadn't heard of Govind Swarup. I heard of him. I knew there was a telescope, but nothing beyond that. I didn't know what he did, who he was, how much work it took, what was the situation. And somebody told me, this is an interesting guy. Why don't you go and meet him? In fact, it was Bala Iyer of ICTS. You should go and check. So I said, okay. Then I wrote to him. I said, please come. And I went, met him. And I heard his story. I found it quite fascinating. Then I did more research, went to TIFR, went to the archives, and it became more and more interesting. And actually, that was the key point. Meeting Govind Swarup was the turning point for me. Once I learned what he did, and the rest of the book just came on its own. Then I realized how the structure should be. That you have a story in astronomy, we have a story in chemistry, we have a story in biology, which is quite small at the moment because biology is started much later. But the common theme was actually the struggle. What Govind Swarup went through, almost everybody went through in different ways.
So for those of you who will, I'm absolutely certain, acquire this book and read, allow me to just give you a glimpse into how the book is divided. So as Hari already mentioned, the first section is on space with several chapters in it, which cover the story which starts with Govind Swarup, and therefore, the turning point for Hari, as he mentioned, moves on to Venkataraman Radhakrishnan, C.V. Raman's son, and the later director of the Raman Research Institute, to U.R. Rao and the first satellite, Satish Dhawan, and the realization of the ISRO dream. Interspersed within sort of what these stories are. So to some extent, those of us who are familiar with 20th century history of science will have heard these names. As Hari mentioned, we will have known the names, we might not know the detailed stories. The detailed stories are of course there, but what I think I found quite intriguing is how other younger scientists are like the second generation is integrated into those stories. So Agarwal, Morar, the other people at RRI. So can you tell us how it was that, so the difficulty, Govind Swarup and the GMRT story convinced you that this was the thread that will run through the thing. The story still could have been told like they're usually told either in journalism or the many National Book Trust, volumes that come out, or even the biographies, very few biographies that are available on the Indian market, are still told through the lives of prominent individuals only, almost as if before and after there aren't other individuals. And I think that is what, to my mind, is very appealing about this book. So can you say how how did that come about? Like why did you decide to integrate, and what were your impressions of these people? Because clearly you met them also.
Yeah, so I knew some people. In the first section in astronomy, I didn't know almost anyone who had been featured prominently. I met them for the book. In the second section, I knew A.B. Ramarao quite well, knew Ashilkar quite well. I knew Sina Rao reasonably well, not very well. But what I wanted to do was to once the book started taking shape, What I wanted to know is how did they work? So doing science, and there was a vast difference between doing science in India and doing science in the West, at least at that time.
Mm.
So we had nothing here. So everybody in the book actually went abroad and came back. This is probably not an accident. I did not want it to be that way, but it became that way by not by choice, but it just grew out that way. So when they came back, they had the best equipment and the best environment, and here we had nothing. So you cannot do the science that they were doing there, coming back to India and do the same thing. You simply can't do. There is no equipment. Now, it's a big thing that they had to decide is what sort of science do you do? Do you continue with what you did, and where you apply for grants? There is no grant agency that provided grants anyway.
Yeah.
You can't import equipment. So what do you do? And so, of course, none of them had to come back, but they came back because they had that was the in thing at that time. India had become independent. They said that we will build the country, and for them, building the country meant building science. So what I really want to understand is, and which was quite enjoyable for me to see that there were people who were not just interested in science. They could fight. They could fight not just to solve a problem in science. They could fight the situation. And all of them had a capacity to fight the situation, and they could figure out ways to use that situation and do the best that they could. So it may not be a science that would win them a Nobel Prize, but it was still very good science. So this is what I learned from all of them, and all of them had that commitment without exception.
So I'm going to ask you towards the end a little more about what are the broad learnings, like if someone were to ask you, okay, what characterizes 20th century or a late 20th century and early 21st century science in India, but I'll come to that later. When the astronomy story, right, like the space and astronomy stories in the first section that you have, you at some point you say something very interesting, where you said that JMRT, when they started out, was supposed to be the largest of its kind in Asia, at least, right?
Yeah.
And at some point, of course, it gets outdated because well, I'll not use that word because that's precisely what you warn us against. At some point, it's superseded by larger telescopes, in a sense.
Yeah,
but
that is Ooty telescope.
Ooty, sorry, not JMRT, Ooty, apology. Where you then say telescopes do not get outdated easily.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this is again something that is quite interesting, because this is something I learned from my own work on cyclotrons, which is that when Chandigarh gets a cyclotron that is built in 1936 in the United States and it's brought to Chandigarh in 1967, of course by then CERN is in place, right? Like, so this is like a tiny thing compared to CERN, but it can still do modern science. It's not an outdated equipment. And I think sort of bringing that to the table from the perspective of the scientists, I found was again something very very interesting, and moving away from the kind of narratives that are continuously sort of thrown at us. I'll characterize the second and the third sections a little bit and then come back again to ask you a few more questions. So it's very funny you say that you did not know many of the figures in astronomy, and you knew many of the people when you talk about matter, as in chemistry, chemical engineering, etc. It was the exact opposite for me. So I knew the people that, I knew the people and the work in the first section. In fact, many of the names, apart from C.N.R. Rao and Mashelkar, were new for me in that section, right? Like I did not know the work of those people. So for those of you who are listening in, Hari looks, of course, at the work of C.N.R. Rao and his later students, so Prasenjit Sen amongst them, etc. He then looks at Manmohan Sharma, who sort of was important for the way University Department of Chemical Technology got shaped in Bombay. And then he looks at the work of B.D. Tilak and Ramarao at NCL, which reminded me of Shiv Vishwanathan's study of the National Physical Laboratory, and the similarities where the work of the labs is incessantly torn between those who want to do fundamental research and those who want to do industrial research. I'll come back to that and ask you a little more. And then you talk about T. Ramasamy, later DST secretary, and Yelavarthi Nayudamma, and his work at the Central Leather Research Institute in Chennai. Now, this is a very unusual assembly of people. Can you tell us a little more? Because, I mean, it's not unusual once you've read it, because I could you've drawn for us the networks, who's going where, right? Like where, for example, CNR Rao intersects with Satish Dhawan, where Manmohan Sharma intersects with some of the others, and including Mashelkar, where B.D. Tilak intersects with Mashelkar and Ramarao, and where Yusuf Hamid shows up, and where, so you show us the networks despite the fields and how they intersect in the book. But for those of us who are now waiting to read the book, can you tell us a little more about how you went about selecting people in this section, and the stories, not just people, but the stories in this section?
So each one of them had enormous influence in their field. And it was quite easy, the selection of these people. I looked at who had the maximum influence. So CNR Rao obviously was, influenced entire science, not just chemistry, and especially in material chemistry, in material science. And chemical engineering in India would not have been like this without M.M. Sharma. Mashelkar brought into India, a different way of thinking, after as a director, and then later in CSR, how to think about science as a business, how to be internationally competitive, how to look at intellectual property. And then A.B. Ramarao really started the generics industry in India by the trying to make very, very difficult molecules, and he had the courage to do that. Well, nobody had the courage to do that. And Ramasamy, because he solved a very important social problem, because the way leather industry was organized, most of the companies had no R&D. They cannot have R&D. But yet they were losing outdated technology, and because they grew and the pollution became significant. Because before the 70s it was too small, but when they started growing, the pollution became significant, and they could not work that way. But they didn't have the capacity to do R&D and discover a new process. So it was an enormous social impact. So each of these individuals had impact. The common theme was they were using chemistry. Even in chemical engineering, they were using chemistry a lot. But they all had big impact in their fields. So that is why I decided to pick these.
Could you share with us the story of Ramasamy's work in leather processing? So what was the social problem he solved?
Yeah, the problem was they were essentially, none of them had pollution control, except the larger companies. So there's some, when the problem grew and the river started getting polluted, the water table started getting polluted, cases were filed in the Supreme Court. And it was actually losing a battle, because there was no way that they could have solved it on their own, except probably some of the larger companies. So the Supreme Court was on the verge of ordering them to close down when he intervened. Accidentally, he met some of these people on the flight when on the day he took over as CLRA director. Not on the day, when he came, probably one of the first few days. And he was returning when he met them in the flight, and they told him that we are going to close down because of this. So then he went to the chief minister, to the other Tamil Nadu ministers, convinced them that he will take a look at this, he'll try to solve them. Of course, they cannot directly interfere because it's the Supreme Court, but somehow things worked out, and the Supreme Court allowed him some time to let the units stop polluting. So the problem was there are about 400, 500 units, and each unit was different. So you cannot have a common technology. So each one had to have a different technology. So he tackled this in two levels, using the chemistry that he had done in the 80s. He changed the tanning process, developed some new materials, tanning materials, and reduced the pollution. at source. And then second, each one of the units, he gave a separate solution. People from CLRI went to every unit, every of these 400, 500 companies, stayed there, looked at the problem and gave a separate solution. And it was implemented and they continued to run. But the problem was, it was easy to close them down, but a lot of jobs were at stake. And most of these women, the other units and downstream processing units had women employment, probably about 90%. And all of them were dual jobs, so although it was not, science in the sense like in the other chapters, he still used some very, very good science and a combination of technology and science that solved the problem.
And you see that actually in the other questions you tackle as well. You've spoken about A.V. Rama Rao and his work in producing diazepam as well as vitamin B6. Do you want to pick one of the two sort of stories, whichever one you feel is, which you feel more, compelled to share with our audience today?
So vitamin B6 was the most difficult problem that he has worked on in his career. Even now, he has worked on many difficult molecules. This one he thinks is the most difficult. But diazepam was special in a different way because he had not done anything at that time. Rama Rao's history is he went to NCL quite late and through a series of accidents. So he didn't do well at school. In fact, he failed in 10th standard. And then for 1 year, he did not study. And then his father did not think that he would become, he would even get a job. And his father's ambition for him was for him to become a stenographer in the government, in the Andhra government. So his father was a stenographer, by the way. And then after 1 year, Rama Rao suddenly decided, I'm going to go back to school. And then he did extremely well. He's finished his school, higher secondary. It was called inter-science in those days, I think. And then did his BSc. Then worked as a demonstrator there. Then finally reached UDCT. He studied chemical technology, an additional BSc, not a postgraduate degree. And then even after chemical technology, it was not easy for him to do a PhD. He was older than most students. And somebody with a BSc in chemistry and a BSc in postgraduate degree in chemical technology, which was not considered a master's, I think, at that time. It would have been difficult for him to get admission for PhD. But as luck would have it, Venkatraman at NCL was looking for people, and Rama Rao ended there. And because he came from UDCT, Venkatraman easily gladly took him. And he got his PhD quickly and then went on. But he had not tackled, and at that time he was a scientist and at NCL, but working on a PL 480 project on deputation. So he was not part of NCL, but he was part of NCL. So sort of divided loyalty.
Yeah, like a project staff person. Yeah.
Project staff.
Yeah.
And that was when India changed the Patent Act, 1971. And Indira Gandhi wrote to many directors of CSR, all directors of CSR, that they should now work for national goals. CSR, although called an industrial research laboratory, used to work on fundamental research quite a bit.
Yeah.
And transfer of technology to industry was not that much. So this letter reached Tilak, who was the director at NCL. So he called everybody and said, now I've got this letter, all of you have to work for national goals, now you have to work with industry. And many scientists in that group protested, especially the senior scientists. We cannot do that. We don't get industrial salaries and so on and so on. So, and then Tilak looked at Rama Rao and said, you have no future in this lab if you don't work on such problems. And it was indirectly, he told Rama Rao what he could not tell the senior scientists. He used Rama Rao as a sort of a prop. So after he came back, he wanted to work on something that was useful, but he was on this PL 480 project doing something else. Um, so because of his background in chemical technology, he had studied medicinal chemistry. He went to the library, looked at the pharma journals and looked at the drugs that are being launched at that time. Then he found diazepam, which low in volume but very high price. So it was a best-selling drug for at that time for Roche. So somehow they had no one else other than Roche could make the drug, as it involved very complicated stages. Especially there was a substance that looked like a rock in between, which had to be extracted, and he didn't know how to extract it. And after reading through this process, he realized that this is very difficult and he will not be able to do. But then the problem never left him. In his mind. It remained for a month or so, and then he started trying to write alternative routes on his paper. And then in a few months, he had a sort of a route which he thought would work. And then he started working at night, because during the day he was working on the other project, the US project. Got somebody who didn't have work rather. He had a job to do the experiments during the day. The main experiments he did at night. In another few months, he had made 5 milligrams of the chemical. But he didn't tell anybody. It remained there. And one day he had to go to Bombay because some plants that he used in the PL480 project, he was not getting. So he wanted to find out why they were not coming. So in Crawford Market, there was a trader who used to get these plants and sell them. So met him. So he said, okay, there are some problems in the Himalayas. So we'll get them soon. But it was around 11:30 or 12. His train back to Pune was 5 o'clock. So then this trader took him to Sipla, where he was going, and introduced him to Hamid. And they had not met that time. So Yusuf Hamid had just come back from the UK, and he was doing some R&D to make some new products. So when Hamid saw that he had brought, this trader had brought a chemist from NCL, started asking him, and Hamid knew that the new directive from the director. He thought he would be working on some useful products, and Ramarao told him about fundamental research that he was doing, and in which Hamid was not interested. So then I asked him, "What are you working? And are you working on any product?" He said, "I'm working on diazepam. I have made 5 milligrams." And he almost jumped off his chair, because Hamid wanted to make that product. So on the back of the envelope, he drew up, a wrote, "This is how I made it." And he was quite surprised because it was quite easy. And he said, "I want to buy the technology." So, which surprised Ramarao, because 5 milligrams, nobody transfers technology. It is too early. You have to scale up, and you make in kilogram quantities and then you sell. But Hamid still wanted to buy the idea. So the next weekend, he used to go to Pune for the races every Saturday or once every Saturday, alternate Saturday or something. He went to NCL, met Tilak, and he bought the technology for 30,000 rupees. And Tilak did not know how to value the technology because they had not sold anything. So that was the first sale that happened from NCL, technology transfer. So this was a turning point for Ramarao in more ways than one, because he established a friendship with Yusuf Hamid. And that friendship continued throughout their lives. And they're still strong friends. They still talk to each other. And a lot of products have been developed since then, including the anti-AIDS drug in the 90s, which made Hamid famous and Sibla famous.
I think what the stories in this section on matter and chemical technology and chemistry, as you've sort of included those stories there. I think what was most interesting for me was the network, right? Like the network of interactions, which spanned from industry and manufacturing and production to industrial research to university, and how they're all linked to each other, how they are all sort of interacting with each other. How there are generations sort of crossing each other in different spaces. And I think this kind of an understanding of the space is new in a sense. We have, well, there's no in a sense. It's new. We haven't seen this kind of work written about India until now, right? And that's novel, and that's I mean, for me, it's fabulous to have that kind of an understanding of that space. So again, for our listeners and who are going to read this in your book, the next section is on life. Is called Life, where you start sort of again wasn't a surprise. It was G.N. Ramachandran, and then it was fascinating to see people who are around us and who now we all well, not all, but people in the Bangalore scene at least, and that's another question I'll have for you later. A lot of people are from Bangalore apart from a few, so I'd also like to understand what you think about the place of Bangalore in the science scene. There's Balram, there's M. Vijayan, there's Obed Siddiqui, there's Jayant Udgaonkar, Satyajit Mayer, and Madan Rao, right? Whose father, of course, features in the first section on space with Aryabhatta and the first satellite. So and what is remarkable if one looks at the three sections is that the second section, it has more, well, industry is present in a strong manner in the second section. It is less so in the first and it is less so in the third and sort of medium in the first, because you still have a need for example, the Tata engineering consultants coming and working on the antenna, etc. So what I want to ask you is, I've sort of given an overview on what is included in each of the sections and the chapters. What I'd like to know now is, again, coming to, so you've answered the question in one manner. I'd like you to attempt to answer it in another way. How did you go about choosing the people you choose? And I'll tell you why I'm asking you that question again. Because if I take your answer about impact at face value, I'm missing some people here, right? And that's, of course, always an author's nightmare to justify our selections. And I've been in that position before. So Roddam Narasimha and Flow Solver, right? Which was, again, sort of, when the Americans denied the use and the import of Cray and supercomputing to India, Flow Solver was built, on the ground here. The nuclear establishment is almost completely absent from your selections. And then another sort of section is medical research, medicine sciences, right? Like, so I'm thinking here of India's first female fellow of the Royal Society, Gagandeep Kang, who's going to speak later today, is in one of our events. So, and again, one could draw up a list. I'm not. This list is not to say they should have been there or that others shouldn't have been there or whatever, but just to help you tell us more about why this particular slicing of the history of the unfolding of the scientific community and the landscape in India.
So once I decided what the book is going to be, about a year later after I started work, I also decided that I'm going to cover some people in depth rather than giving a complete list, comprehensive list of the best. So I also decided that this is not a book about the best science done in India. This is a book about how science was done in the first 50 years after independence. And the book sort of ends in the mid-90s. And towards the end 90s, only the first 50 years. After that, there is nothing. There is an epilogue which just summarizes what happens. So then the decision was, what do I cover, and what do I leave out? Choice was, in astronomy, it was easy because Govind Swarup means I've covered radio astronomy. Nobody had done anything close to what he had done. So he has to be there, right? And many of these things began with him. Now, what else? So because it was radio astronomy, I thought I would look at one more radio astronomer, which was Radhakrishnan. And this was difficult because there is no doubt about what Govind Swarup did. These two telescopes are there; they're still there and working very well. It is not easy to figure out, the impact of Radhakrishnan. So he did try a lot of things. In the end, he tried to build a telescope, which was very difficult to do, and it did not really succeed. So, what was his impact? Choosing him, what was his impact? That was one question, but I thought I would justify it after I tell the next story also. And then the next one was X-ray astronomy. So X-ray astronomy had a very interesting beginning. It was an accident because B.V. Srikantan,
Yes.
after his PhD, he went to MIT and came back. And when he went to MIT, he saw the birth of X-ray astronomy, and he sort of participated in the first experiment, in X-ray astronomy. So it was natural for him to come back and try to do something similar here. So that what began at that time actually ended in 2014. What began in the 60s, which Srikantan going to MIT and coming back and starting a program on X-ray astronomy, ended with the launch. No, well, it did not end, but for me, in my mind, it went right up to 2014 because the students he created built the astrosat. So that was another story, which I found quite fascinating. So having selected these two, radio astronomy and X-ray astronomy, there was no place for anything else because it's already so I could not start anything else because it would have meant another 100 pages, which was not possible. Anyway, I thought I had given enough for people to read about in these two areas. And radio astronomy, by the way, India has done exceptionally well. It is, we are among the best nations in the world in terms of our research. And if you talk about why I chose Radhakrishnan in the end, although it is not a success story as Govind Swarup, because he did radio astronomy, he started a radio astronomy program. Because he was a radio astronomer, he started a radio astronomy program in RRI. And what it meant that you seeded another institution where people did astronomy. Before he came in, there was no astronomy in RRI. Now, it was important to have centers, various centers. Suddenly, in TIFR, it was sort of, after all these people retired, after Agarwal retired, after Rao retired, everybody who built the astronaut, KP Singh, all of them retired one by one. And X-ray astronomy sort of ended in TIFR. It seemed that they're going to end. So if suddenly one institution, goes down like this, go down with not by choice, but people retire and new people have other programs. So you have to have another place where people can continue. So RRI became one such place. But fortunately, TIFR, it's coming back. I think they're starting X-ray astronomy once again, hiring some people.
So I'm going to ask you, so space you cover in about 126 pages, matter you cover in about 113 pages, and life is 35 pages.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to tell our audiences because they're going to be surprised when they see that, and you have, of course, a very, very plausible sort of explanation for that.
Well, it could have been longer, not 35 pages. It could have been another 20, 30 pages. But there was some practical difficulty because COVID started by that time.
Yeah.
And I had to shorten that section because I could not work. But more than that, biology started much later.
Yes.
And of course, J.N. Ramachandran started in the 50s, but the institution that he built, that is Molecular Biophysics Unit, was started only in the 70s. And they waited for a long time for money to get going. And by the time they got going, it was the mid 80s. So, and the book ended in the 20th century. So I had only 15 years of biology there in the book. So obviously it will be shorter.
Fair enough. Any story or any element or any aspect of what you looked at that surprised you completely?
Well, obviously Govind Swarup. It was astonishing what he did. It still is astonishing after learning so much and after writing about him. To conceive of a telescope that was 4 times larger than anything in the world, of a radio telescope, when we had built nothing, that required a lot of courage. And we had nobody he was the only radio astronomer in the country. And he, one fine morning, he sat in his library and suddenly got this idea. So I'm going to build this telescope. That was something. And it still surprises me, how he took that decision.
Yeah.
Um,
that's amazing, actually. Also, so when one reads in the book about the people who came to work with him, but also repeats in some other chapters also, where something that I saw in my own work for cyclotrons, which is when, the Rochester cyclotron, for example, arrived in Chandigarh, and they just say, we opened the crates. We had no idea what a cyclotron looked like. We had only seen two-dimensional diagrams.
Yeah.
So you work with a team that doesn't know what you're building, and that has been accomplished again and again in various fields in science in India. And I think this needs to be, on the forefront of our discussions. And I'm glad that, you are now bringing it out with this book for various other fields. I'd like to ask you, this is my, because we need to also take audience questions. So please start typing your questions in the Q&A box. This is my penultimate question to you, which is, you've spoken about difficulty, and the BIC announcement talks about constraints, science under constraints. You've talked about difficulties of realizing projects, and we are aware of anyone who's done science in India knows that very well. Many of us have now, because of our work, come to know about it. There are two aspects of these difficulties, and they again come up again and again. I'm looking at a work written in the 1960s by a visiting American scholar about Indian science, right? And he calls it Sarkar and Vigyan, right? Like as a play on C.P. Snow's Science and Government. He calls it Government and Science, and also kind of writes the title in Hindi, but writes the book in English. Yeah. So the reason to mention this is the two kinds of difficulties are, one is the difficulty of scarcity, of making do under constraints and trying to find different ways. The second is social engineering. The hierarchies, at points what you have called feudalism, and people who you spoke to have called it that. Can you say a little more about what it is that you learned, given simply the number of people you've spoken to and the kind of depth in which you have understood them and conveyed their work to us in the book? Can you say a little bit more about what are the social aspect of that makes doing science difficult in India? Scarcity and absence of supportive engineering and supporting industry, well understood by now. It's the social bit that I'm interested in understanding.
So things have changed now. But in the 60s and 50s, 60s and 70s, things were very different. What I'm going to say is probably true more at that time than now. Yeah. So when you work in a situation, the classic case is the Indian Institute of Science. Indian Institute of Science at that time, not now. Now it's a very different institution. So people used to join as lecturers and retire as lecturers. For 30 years, there was no progress. And since there was no money, they could not do much. They worked in very ordinary problems. And when everybody is working on such problems, at some point you lose interest, and you lose ambition. So doing science well requires a lot of courage and the ability to take risks. And even assuming, and after a long period of this, probably would have started much earlier than that. I remember, a letter from Maurice Travers, which finally did not make it into the book, but I saw in the Institute of Science archives, where he writes to his mother before he had taken over as director of IISc, about the bureaucracy here. How it is very hard to get money for any sort of innovation, and they're not interested. But the government will give you a shirt if you have a button. So that's what he wrote. So this was in 1909 or 1908. So things were like this since then. So after such long period of stasis or whatever you can call it is hard for one person, even if that person is very ambitious, to suddenly think of doing something extremely difficult and risky. And if you do that, the environment just wasn't there. And in many of these cases, you have to do something unconventional. So if you were a chemist like C.N.R. Rao was, he wanted equipment that chemists did not use in IISc.
Yeah.
But physicists used that equipment, but it belonged to them, and he could not get it, because they would ask, why does a chemist want this?
Yeah.
And this continued for a long time.
Yeah.
Till he himself broke it. He was probably responsible to bring down the barriers. But that is not the case now. But it is still clear that we don't do risky science enough.
Why is that the case, in your assessment?
Old habits die hard.
Okay. My last question before we start taking questions from the audience is, what are the 3 ways or 3 characteristics you would say of 20th century science as conducted in India that you would like to share with your audience? In a sense, what are the 3 takeaways that you want the audience or the reader to take from your book?
What I learned was to do well in science in India at that time, probably even now, you require much more than intelligence. You needed grit, and that grit is not to solve a problem. You have to solve much more serious problems around you.
Yeah.
That was the most important thing, and I did not know how much they had to struggle to do one piece of research. And those who had this perseverance always succeeded, not the most talented scientist.
Yeah.
Second, compared to this, others are probably minor. It is still surprising that we had been talking about science, even Nehru, that we call universities temples of learning, built all these institutions. But nobody thought that you can build an institution, but we have to make things easy for them to work.
Yeah.
That was never done, and I have never understood why. I don't know why they did not do that. You build in an IISc or an IIT or a TIFR, and then make things so difficult. What is the point?
Yep. And your last point?
I don't have a strong last point.
Okay. No problem. I think 2 is enough. So thank you for indulging me and taking my questions. It's been fascinating reading the book, and I as a historian of science who spent the last 20 years looking mainly at physical sciences in the 20th century, I hugely recommend the book because of the complex picture of, as I said, the networks, and by networks I don't mean it in the way economists use it or the way information scientists use it, but science communities, right? Like, how is a community formed? How does intergenerational science work? How do intergenerational scientists interact? Where do they converge? Where does industry come into the picture? How does education kind of fall along the boundaries? Where does science happen at all? And why that might be actually of interest to us in our day-to-day lives. I think it's a wonderful attempt, and I hope to see many more such books. I hope this book inspires many others to actually, start looking at the end of the 90s, where Hari has left the baton to be taken on by the next person and, take it forward. So I would have asked you what's your next project and are you going to write another book, but I'll let you say that right towards the end. I'll take our audience's questions. So we have Vidyadhar Date, who wants to know, I'm sure he's a colleague of yours in the journalist field for a long time. Did J.D. Bernal and J.B.S. Haldane and people like that influence you?
No.
Who were your inspirations then?
Inspire me for what? For writing?
To write this book, yeah.
Well, the writers whom I admired were all journalists. They were not scientists.
Okay.
I had a preference for books, good science books written by science journalists, than good science books written by scientists. Because I could also see what they did, how they did this, why they chose a certain sentence instead of something else. And two books I really enjoyed reading. One was The Man Who Knew Infinity by Robert Kanigel.
Yeah.
And the other one was Chaos by James Glick, which I still think, I read it twice and I still think the best science book I've read.
Okay, wonderful. So Vijay Sood wants to know, while he has not read the book, and I hope he will, would it be correct to say that several of the events and developments were accidental in the lives of the many individuals covered?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because it was an accident that Srikantan reached MIT precisely at the time that they were doing a very, very major experiment, and he participated in the experiment. And because of that, he came back and built an X-ray astronomy team. He had some students who built more students, developed more students, and ultimately built India's first space observatory. Many things, many accidents, not just this.
Yeah, serendipity, right? Like, and that's something you see often, irrespective of whether
there is one chapter, and when Mashilkar, the last one third of the chapter is actually on serendipity, on one specific project. I don't want to say it, but I would rather, it take a long time to explain it, but how serendipity, actually helps in research.
Yep. Deepika has just a factual question, and I'm guessing you'll be able to answer it very quickly. Which years was the research on diazepam done?
I don't remember the years. It is in the mid-70s.
Mid-70s, yeah, that's what I thought as well from what I remember. Mohan Devegowda's question is, in his perception, most of our premier science institutions aren't doing as well as they do, given especially the heavy taxpayer expenditure on them. Why is this the case? Or do you think this is the case at all? That would be my question.
No, I don't think that is the case. So if you look at the money we spend, and look at the number of papers we publish, per dollar spent, we do pretty well. I don't have the figures, I don't remember the figures, but it's easy to see. In terms of citations also, I think we do reasonably well, not as well as the number of papers, but again, compared to the amount of money we spent, we do okay. But the problem is this is very uneven. There are some institutions who do exceptionally well, and because of that, they get all the money. But while others don't do that well, so they don't get any money. So that is a problem.
I think you're anticipating Samir Brahmachari's next question. If I'm not mistaken, this is the same person who's also figured in the book. And at least the science community knows who he is. So Dr. Brahmachari's question is, why do you think some institutions continue to excel and some don't?
Well, it's obvious that it depends on who is the leader. I don't think it is a very satisfying answer, but that's what I can think of. There must be many other factors at play. What is possible at that time? What subject is more important? Some subjects decline, and institutions don't change quickly enough to newer areas. Again, it depends on the person in charge. But re-engineering an institution is not that easy, particularly if it is large.
True. Yeah, leadership. I mean, I do think there is room to actually understand leadership without going into the hagiographic model of sort of looking at great figures. I have a question here from Sudhish Venkatesh about the proton decay experiments in the Kolar Gold Fields, where he says it was a potential Nobel Prize winning experiment, which is true. We've known that. Others overseas who worked on a similar experiment with lesser constraints were recognized. Can you say a little more? Was this an illustration of Indian science and the constraints? What exactly happened? Was there sort of, I mean, I'll just add to it saying, was there a paucity of the number of people who worked with Srikantan on that experiment? So can you tell us a little more about it?
So this does not feature in the book.
Yeah.
Kolar Gold Fields, Srikantan did his PhD.
Correct.
That is the only part that features in the book.
Yes.
I'm aware of the proton decay experiment. I'm aware that what they did, but I don't know why it did not get the Nobel Prize, and what is the difference between what they did and the Nobel Prize winning discovery. I don't know. I don't know enough for me to say anything about that.
Okay. It is, I mean, it is though, and I think we'll both agree on that, a very, very interesting area of inquiry. Yeah. Simply because, I mean, Homi Bhabha was a cosmic ray physicist, as was Sarabhai to begin with.
Yeah.
And it is from there that they found their entry into nuclear physics at all, right? Like the study of particles. And then Srikantan and others took it further, with Bernard Peters coming in from Rochester, from Rochester, etc. So it is a field waiting to be written about in a sense. And, the archives are there. So I think if there are any students wanting to work with me or any journalists wanting to work with Hari to write that, do get in touch. Jayant Murthy, I'm guessing from the Indian Institute of Astrophysics, wants to know, TIFR was at the forefront of X-ray astronomy in the 60s, that was allowed to deteriorate, as is true in many cases. Difficult questions, I have to say, Hari. I don't know how to answer these. Do you have any ideas about why areas of expertise are allowed to decay or were allowed to decay?
Well, people's priorities change, and one generation of scientists had some priorities.
Correct.
And the next generation may have other priorities. Directors have different priorities. One director may not share the vision of another director. So things change, and sometimes it's I don't think it's uncommon. It happens everywhere.
I agree. Dr. Brahmachari has another question for you. Is risk and reward system in India adequate? And if not, what according to you is the solution?
I don't know.
It is a difficult question, but I think you can answer at least the first part of it.
Well, he is far more familiar with this than I am. Suppose our reward system in institutions where scientists have to produce a certain number of papers, every year or every 2 years, and you can't be unproductive. You can't work on a difficult problem for 3 years or 4 years and not produce anything.
Yeah.
And after end of 4 years, there's no guarantee that you'll show something, right? But the 4 years may have been wasted. But after 4 years, you may come up with something extraordinary also. So that sort of system is not possible in India, I think. But scientists would know better than me what is actually the case.
I think you're playing it safe, Hari. Raj Shekhar's question for you is, do you have any plan to write a book on Professor Rautam Narasimha?
Not at the moment.
Okay. L.V. Krishnan says there are some notable instances of science industry links from Bengal. You're clearly aware of it. Any reason there is no mention of it in the book?
So there are so many things that should be in the book, in a book of history.
Yeah.
But that is not there. But this is not a book, a book of history. In the sense, it's not 50 years of Indian science, a comprehensive history of Indian science.
Yeah.
This is about a specific aspect, and especially about people. The book is more about how people work, how people solve problems, how they reacted in certain situations, all related to science. This is not a story of the best science, as I've said already once, of the best science done in India in the last 70 years.
Shravanti Bakchi has a very interesting question for you. The narrative of Indian science in popular perception and popular culture has always been one of making do, of celebrating, and on occasion also glorifying constraints. Has this done a disservice to Indian science?
I'm not sure it has been glorified, that much. So the constraints that we talk about here are of a different nature than the constraints that people talk about. This is the constraint of not having money, not having equipment, and not having industry to build an equipment for you if you want to. There are no components. You have no foreign exchange. And if you want to, Ramarao, I mentioned there, Ramarao wanted to read a patent. And if you want to read a patent, you have to pay $1 to the US Patent Office. And there is no provision in RBI rules to sanction $1. So that means you don't read the patent. You don't know. Journals come very late. And then many scientists did not have money to send their papers by airmail. So they send by ship, and they send a letter by airmail saying that I'm sending this paper. And then the actual paper, which is quite thick, goes by ship 3 months later. These are all bizarre practices, even by contemporary standards, they were bizarre. Contemporary Indian standards, they were bizarre. So those are the sort of constraints that I'm write about in the book, and not the daily problems that we always face today. Money coming late, or having needing 10 signatures over a travel grant or things like that. Those are, compared to these problems, these are quite ordinary. So I don't know if you celebrate the ordinary problems, probably it is too much. But the earlier problems were real serious problems, and I don't think science done in that situation can be celebrated too much.
So Shravanti is just clarifying that she doesn't mean in the book, of course, but in more mainstream media and films, etc. So I'll ask you the next question from Anita Rampal, who would like to know, so how would you read the nature of science education in India, both sort of early education as well as higher education, and how does that play out in the kind of academic and industrial research that we're able or not able to do?
This is a bit outside my field of expertise, but I can still try to answer a bit from my own experience. As I said initially, I did not enjoy even one science class. I right up to 12th standard and in 3 years of undergraduate degree, not even one. I did not enjoy reading any textbook. I don't think I would have, and I chose English literature after that, and I did enjoy some classes. So there is something wrong. Probably things have changed. I grew up in a very small town, in an area, in an era where there was no internet, no TV. So things are different now, probably, but I can see, textbooks are still boring. I can see from my daughter's textbooks.
So I'll ask you the last question for this evening from Ruhi Soni. How do you even go about gathering so much information? What places did you seek out for research? I assume not all of this information is available online. I think this is an important question to answer for the kind of work you do and the kind of work I do and the kind of work our colleagues do, because often I think it is not entirely clear how difficult it is to get sources, and I think getting access to people is probably easier, but getting access to sources is often so difficult in order to be able to write something convincing. So I think it would be actually very useful to answer that question. So how does even one go about doing something like this?
So it is interesting that the scientists who worked that faced a lot of constraints and had to adjust their work and the choice of problems according to what they could do. So similarly, I had to also adjust my work according to what I could do. Certain things I could do, certain things I could not do, because the information wasn't there. And some certain areas were very rich. TIFR had a good archives. So I could learn a lot about Govind Swarup and Srikantan and a few others about whom I did not write. But that was not the case with M.M. Sharma or NCL, in Mashilkar, and later IICT. Even IISc. I went through the archives of IISc. The things that I wanted were not there. So if you're writing about 10 individuals, and you have very rich information about 3 or 4, and not enough about the other 6 or 7. What do? This is a problem. It was a very serious problem for me. So I had to bring down the quality of narrative to suit the information that I had. If I had the similar kinds of information about everybody, it would have been a different book. And some people had died, most people hadn't in the book, and I was lucky. So I could do the interviews with them. And almost all of them spent a lot of time. And in fact, 5, 6, 7 hours, Govind Swarup, I had not less than 50 email exchanges with him, and very detailed. And I met him 4 times, and probably about 6 or 7 long phone calls. So similarly, I could not do this for everybody. Some people, got frustrated quickly, and they did not want to talk. So this unevenness is always there.
Yes.
And this was the biggest challenge that I faced while writing the book. Everybody cooperated. If all the information was there, it would be very easy to write a book.
And it would be a different book.
Yeah.
I confirm your experience when I was writing as well. I mean, I have gone to various archives, and sometimes I've used the entire archive I got from one person, because that was the only material I got. And sometimes I used like one letter from an archive, which was extremely rich with many other things. So it is uneven, and we don't have a strong archiving culture for science in India, and I think that needs to change. Let me thank you, Hari, for having written this book, and I hope this inspires many others to write many other books, to explore science, to understand how difficult it is to actually do the kind of work that you've done. And I urge our audiences to go get the book. Hopefully you will get the hard copies before Hari and I get ours, and enjoy the book. And thank you, BIC, again for inviting us, or inviting me to conduct this discussion, and for bringing this book to the wider audiences.
Thank you. Thank you, Jahnavi.
Thank you, Hari, and thank you, Jahnavi, for this very interesting session, and on our scientists succeeding despite the odds. The 3 sections of the book help me understand the origin of the title, Space, Life, Matter. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.